This is Thriving in Business and Life. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Welcome back to the program.
So we dove into assessment last week. We were talking previously about vision, and then started taking a look at the need to really assess the current situation so we really are clear about where we are and, what's in front of us as we pursue a vision.
Yeah, and one of the points I think we made in our rambling kind of spontaneous way was how important it is to do our assessments of the way things are inside a visionary framework. In other words,
yes.
We don't just look at things because it's so easy to get bogged down when we look at things. We look at things with a certain perspective. We've got our vision in place, our goal, we know where we're heading, we're clear about our objectives. Now it's important to look at the way things are so we know our starting points.
We did make that point, and I want to just reemphasize that because as you were saying it, I just realized how many assessment sessions I've been in with clients where the assessment gets so scorching, if you will, that the vision is lost track of or withers under the weight of an assessment. And doing the assessment within a visionary context goes back to that place where you often say, live in the vision and visit the current situation.
Yeah, and a simple way to put this, which sheds a real light on why so many intractable problems remain unsolvable, is we need to know where we're going. We need to know what our destination is. Now, that could sound like kind of a, nice saying, but if we look at that and analyze, do a little assessment on the way things are in society, it's easy to recognize that we don't have agreement on where we want to go. Like, do we agree on how we want to handle the immigrant problem? Do we agree on how the economy should be? Everybody's got their differing positions. Now, in the book, Getting to Yes, which I often celebrate as a great solution to this, they propose starting every assessment with a vision that everybody at the table agrees on. So we agree that children should be safe and should have enough food, should have a roof over their head. That's not hard to agree on. So we agree on the destination, and then we go back to our very different positions, very different belief structures, but now we have a way to navigate from our different positions because we've agreed on the destination.
Well, it's when we look at social issues, they become far more complex using the same approach in our personal life and with our personal goals and visions. Hopefully we can be in agreement with ourselves. So at times I think we have inner conflicts as well.
Right, that's the first step.
The process we're going to explore today really is, you could say, almost grows out of assessment, and that is optimizing resources. First, assessing what they are, and then being able to optimize resources in the pursuit of a vision, in the pursuit of a goal or a result that we have aimed for and are holding in our mind. So, you work with coaching people a lot. What's one of the main things you see in terms of people's sometimes inability to realize the resources around them?
Well, it's a fundamental mindset problem where the very term creativity has become associated with ideas. Mm-hmm. So we think if you're creative, it's because you have ideas. Let's get creative usually initiates a brainstorm. Now, that's valid, but it's only one half of the picture. Resources, we like to say, are the raw material for creativity. So to open this up is to acknowledge that there's more than ideas required for a creative endeavor. And that takes us to looking at the resources we've got. Look around the table. Who's there? What do they bring to the table? What have we got to work with? So that's the first step, is just to open up our understanding of what causes creativity. It isn't just mental, it's physical too.
Right, and as we start to look at it too, tapping into, what are the ways we could accomplish this? That might be a way to tap into resources. The who, the what, the how, all those things start to come into play. But another thing that I have learned over the years and keep getting reminded of is that a lot of the key resources that we might utilize are off our radar. We're not aware they're even there.
Do you have an example of that, Chris?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind was a client that was trying to change their culture from being top down to being one that was more inclusive. And the pattern of how things had been done had been very top down, and so they started thinking, well, how are we going to go about doing that? How are we going to make that meaningful? Well, as we began to explore it, somebody in the room on the leadership team said, well, we've talked about adopting a lean management approach. If we were to do that, we would become naturally inclusive.
Interesting.
So it was something that nobody was even thinking about except for one person who remembered a conversation they'd had weeks before.
Yeah.
And as they began to adopt that approach, the very process itself helped them to become more inclusive in a really practical way.
Well, it's a perfect example, and it actually harkens back to our original model. I like to feel this is our primary thriving model, which is the change model with the 3 components. Got the results you're getting. Then there are the actions that are causing those results. But back of it is the mindset, the thinking that contributes to what's done that gets those results. In your story, somebody went upstream to the mindset. They didn't just stay focused on the action, right?
Right. Well, and started to, if we were talking just a minute ago about vision and assessment. So if you think about it, they were going through that process. They had a vision, a result they wanted to create, that they all agreed on, that it would be valuable to become more inclusive because they'd been overlooking some things that had caused them problems.
Right.
So they started to look resource-wise in things they had been doing in the behavior box, right?
Right.
And finally somebody else went, well, there's a whole other way to look at this mindset box.
Yeah.
What if we used a lean approach, which immediately led right back to the behavior box, right? And helped create the action they wanted.
Well, in the lean model, one of the things I love most about that is that it frames every endeavor as a learning experience.
Right.
Which separates blame from responsibility. I can be responsible without getting blamed for what happens.
Yeah. So it's, this whole idea of resources. I remember the first time I heard the idea, if you get real clear on your vision of what you want, what's in that result box that you're aiming for, and you just are going for it, assuming that things are going to show up. It's remarkable what shows up,
Well, we both know this from experience, and it's fair to say we also both know the frustration of trying to help people understand this principle and actually implement it. You and I were just in a breakfast meeting this morning, fascinating conversation, and at one point I posed a question as we looked at the insurmountable problems in our society, what can we do? And as you recall, it was difficult to make any headway on that, because we kind of are paralyzed with how big the problems are. But as we're saying in this conversation, it begins with some kind of vision.
Well, and also begins by scaling the problem down to something that we can have an impact on.
Right.
I think the overwhelm that a lot of times people feel in society is when we allow ourselves to be so overwhelmed by the insurmountable size of issues that we do nothing. We get paralyzed rather than saying, it's the old Red Cross crisis motto that we've referred to many times. Do what you can with what you have from where you stand right now.
Well, that's under direct challenge right now. I was reading a really interesting and quite disturbing article about millennial burnout, which included a lot of quotes from millennials who are basically singing the same song, which is that they're paralyzed. That life is so overwhelming for them. They're busy all the time. And as one fellow said, he couldn't even vote because the effort it took to go down to the polling station and vote was too much for him. So there's this sense of there's so much that I should be doing, I can't do anything.
Well, so you go back to resources, and we talk about optimizing resources, not just discovering them, not just using them, but optimizing them. And so what that would mean, there's a certain, you could say, implicit statement in optimizing resources, and that means being very select about which ones I use, when, and where. Because if I don't, If I'm tapping my resources all the time, I will get burned out.
Well, and let's expand our definition of resource, because I don't know what our listeners think of when they hear that word. A lot of us begin to think of physical things, like a computer is a resource, money is a resource, people are resources. But another resource that's very important to leverage is the resource of past successes. In other words, we can use a memory of having succeeded in some difficult circumstance as a resource to build on. Oh, I was faced with real challenges before, and we got through that. We somehow made it. Now, that's more than just a comfort blanket. That's actually something that can really help provide motivation to keep on going when the going gets tough.
Well, we've talked about this before on the importance of feeling a vision and recalling a past success. If we can get into a feeling state about what it felt like to be successful, we are actually firing up a different neurological and chemical pathway in our biology that allows us to think differently, to see things differently. The other resource that I think of as well when I hear what you were talking about is the resource of our own energy. Mm-hmm. You know, and just to recognize that we don't have an inexhaustible supply, at least most of us, and therefore, you know, where am I going to spend my time? Mm-hmm. Where am I going to focus my energy? And when I start to wane, you know, that ability, as you said, to recall a past success sometimes can give me an energy infusion.
Yes.
But if I'm doing that all the time, I will burn out. So that's a challenge I think the millennial generation, you know, speaking of it as a group, and obviously there's many individuals within that group, but as a generation, they are faced with more huge challenges with the potential future of their living environment than we've ever really been consciously aware of before.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and I think as baby boomers, which both of us are, it's really imperative to acknowledge that and to feel some remorse for how we've handled the world from our position of privilege, a lot of us, and position, and the world we're leaving to the youngers. The elders haven't done a really admirable job at, you know, preparing a world that younger people can enjoy the way we enjoyed it when we were their age. I think it's really important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and so, you know, again, I think part of it is it's easy to, you know, see things on a large scale, and part of a solution, even if you look at community action, how community action happens. Successful community action often happens with a couple of people who decide to do something in their own neighborhood.
Right, and they take a few small steps.
Right, and start to develop what are the resources in my immediate sphere to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish.
Well, we've got a great example right here in our Ashland office, which we share with David and Irene, who've run the Ashland Culture of Peace. Well, I remember when they began, it was virtually nothing, a couple of people who were interested. They've stayed with it for years. Well, right now they're in New York, and they'll be addressing the UN. I believe that's tomorrow.
That's right, yeah.
Now, someone might look at that and go, what a grand accomplishment. Anyone who knew them through the years knows that all they did was take one little step at a time and not give up.
Right, and began to tap into the resources of people and ideas and energy around them. And they're presenting the whole idea of what can happen when a citizens commission gets formed to try to really help create a more peaceful environment within a city.
I'd like to return to something you brought up a moment ago, because I think there's some gold to mine there. You talked about emotion and energy in our own state and what we can do using our own energy as a resource. I think when we talk about looking at vision and then looking at the way things are, it's easy to get polarized into physical things again. The vision, what is the result we want? Oh, I'd like to speak at the UN. That could have been a vision David and Irene had. And then the way things are, well, we only have 3 people coming to our meetings. Now, that's valid. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong about that, but if that's all there is, it's limited. As you pointed out, it's important to also identify the feeling. what is the feeling of the vision, and to use that as a compass. Well, similarly, it's important to identify the feeling of the way things are. And in our society, there's a tendency to deny that. And the whole positive thinking movement, which, by the way, was illuminated brilliantly by Barbara Ehrenreich in her book Bright-Sided, how the positive thinking movement has undermined America. I recommend the book. It's a scathing takedown of the one-sided approach, she calls it bright-sided, of just positive thinking, which in our terminology could mean, we don't mean, but it could be interpreted as meaning only consulting the feeling of the vision. Well, actually, if we're going to be fair about this, as part of our assessment and looking at resources, we need to acknowledge the feeling of the way things are right now. Those feelings may not be nearly as enjoyable as the feelings we attach to the vision, which is why we tend to deny them.
Well, and that's where, the ability of going back and forth, is so important. I love a couple of the analogies you use of the elastic band spread between the thumb and the index finger, and that if the index finger represents the vision and the thumb represents the way things are, and there's this tension because the way things are is not yet the vision. And if I over focus on the way things are, the vision collapses into the way things are, and we get stuck. On the other hand, what we're trying to do is pull the way things are toward the vision. But in order to do that, you've got to have that tension. Otherwise, you just have the elastic band dangling from the index finger and nothing's happening, right?
Yeah, Robert Fritz, who wrote about this in his book, The Path of Least Resistance, calls this structural tension. And this, by the way, is what creativity is. Going back to our opening comments, is that tension between the vision and the way things are. Now, in a personal sense, also reconnecting to your comment about our own energy as a resource, it's really ironic that as we get older, there's an assumption that we stop learning and growing and changing. We see the changes in children physically, it's pretty obvious, and their minds develop and they grow up, they leave home, they get careers. But at a certain point in our culture, it's assumed that we stop changing. We mourn the loss of youth and that our bodies are older, etc. But for an older person, an adult, to actually experience the same youthful evolution is rare. We know people who are 70, 80, 90 who still have that sense, that they're young at heart, they're enjoying their lives, they're trying new things. But that's not the norm. Often it's more like you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right?
Right. Well, it's as you're saying that, I was just thinking about my dad. He was always the first one to want to try a new technology. He was an artist and a graphic artist and TV set designer and so on. And he was into his early 70s, I think, when some of the more computer design software started to come out. Now, he could have stuck with his old way of doing it on drawing board and etc. He jumped right in, and he said that it was interesting as some of his younger colleagues asked him why was he bothering to learn this. He was only a few years from retirement. And he said, I'm not retiring. In other words, he just, his whole joy of learning was so great that's what lit him up. And as you're talking about, feeling state as one of our resources, there's another terminology you introduced me to that was really a Buckminster Fuller approach. This whole idea of being able to move back and forth. Pendulation, I think is the term. Yeah. And a back and forth between the vision and the way things are and the vision and the way things are. Since we're talking about optimizing resources, describe that for us a little bit so we get a sense of how that's a process that's a resource, and how that can help us really tap into maybe a feeling that's difficult about the way things are.
Well, it's an immense topic, and one that hasn't been well illuminated in our culture because, as I said, we tend to deny the things that don't feel good and emphasize the things that do feel good, and we often do that with alcohol or, some kind of entertaining distraction. So as we begin to talk about this right now, we're kind of opening a can here, that really deserves some deep thought. It would be as simple on one level as saying, okay, my vision is that the company is successful, cash flow is happening, we've hired the people we need, and everything's doing great, and I feel exhilarated. Pendulating back to, we're out of money, Gwen just quit, we haven't got the money to pay rent this month, and I feel depressed. Then shifting back, I see us succeeding. We've got that contract in Korea that we were hoping to get. Gwen decided to come back to work. I feel grateful and thrilled. Pendulating back to, oh, none of that will ever happen. That's just a pipe dream. We're going down the tube. I'll have to file for bankruptcy and go back to live with my parents. Now, I don't want to go on too long here, but the shifting back and forth is the technique we're talking about. And who has developed that muscle? Because some people will even say, well, it's like a garden, only pay attention to what you want to have grow. Don't go weeding over there or those plants will grow, to justify never putting their attention on the negative stuff. Well, if my roof is leaking, I need to put my attention on the leaking roof or it's going to destroy my home. So there is value in putting our attention both on the vision and on the way things are and feeling both of them.
Let's play with the leaky roof, because as you were saying that, I played with this pendulation idea and I'm starting to get it better, I think. So if I was looking at that, the vision is my roof is sound. It's so comforting to know that no water's getting in. I swing back to, oh my gosh, that I can see a stain on the ceiling where where the water is actually leaking in. Oh no. Then I go back to, it's going to be so awesome. I can see the new tiles on the roof and I feel so great. If I don't fix this thing, the whole roof is going to collapse. Water's going to come in, then it's going to ruin the floor, And so as I do that, what I've started to learn is that if I really get into the urgency or the situation and the possibilities of how it could go wrong, and gather momentum from that, then when I swing back to the vision, I'm even more excited about the vision because I realize the downside of not pursuing it. So swinging to that one side, pendulating to the way things are, and maybe even exaggerating them, can, if we allow it to, create even more critical mass to launch us forward into what we're trying to accomplish.
Exactly, and it's exaggerating the movement in both directions that really creates creative energy. We're talking about energy. You started this part of our conversation acknowledging the resource of our own energy. Well, this is how we build the energy. We swing back and forth, and eventually, and hopefully it won't take too long, especially with the leaking roof, we're shot out into an action. I've got to call Fred. He can fix my roof. Well, if it doesn't go into action, it's just sort of fiddling around with thoughts. It needs to result in action, but is the action led by desperation and feeling panicky, or is it led by this pendulation process that eventually goes, it's going to be great to have a roof that doesn't leak?
Well, and that goes back to something we talked about briefly when we were exploring vision and results now, and that is being able and clear and willing about what is one simple action I can do to put this vision into practice or into play.
Which, by the way, we have to acknowledge is the toughest part of this formula. It's easy to get fascinated by words that suggest some kind of miraculous solution to all our problems. Great, but then taking one little action. For instance, people listening today. Hopefully this is interesting. What's the simple action you're going to take because of what you're hearing?
Right, and that piece to me, I think the overwhelm comes when we start looking. You've used the example before, I'm going to build a website. Yeah. Well, that's a whole series of actions. Right. Maybe the first thing is I'm going to explore which web hosting program would be best.
Yeah, one small step that's connected to another small step, and before you know it, you're in New York addressing the UN.
Right.
Right. Example.
Yeah. So, I think that's, I'll give you an example I had, going back a few years. I had grown up as a big fan of the science fiction and science magazine, Omni. I'd always thought, wow, wouldn't it be great, to someday do something with them. So that had been you could say almost like a fantasy or a dream that I'd had. Well, as I started to get into the to that industry of media production, I happened to have a colleague who had a similar vision. And we started thinking about, wouldn't that be great, you know? Well, we ended up at this large booksellers convention. It's the ABA. It was, at the time, the biggest book-selling association for retailers. And lo and behold, the founder and publisher and editor of Omni Magazine was there selling a book, right? Wow. So, you know, trying to get a meeting with somebody like that is difficult, but we just went, wow, we could. What if we created an audio version of Omni Magazine? You know, so we created this vision. What's one step we could take? That was literally, we said, what's one thing we could do? We could get in line to get a book autographed by her. So we got in line, stood in a long line, got up to the table. She autographed the book, and we said, oh, by the way, we've got a fantastic idea for Omni. And she said, really? And we said, yeah, the Omni audio experience.
Right.
And she went, whoa, you could do that? And we said, 48 channel surround sound. She handed us her card and said, see me in New York next week. Call my assistant.
Seriously?
Yeah, one small action. Right?
And did you see her in New York?
We saw her in New York. We created it. It was a one-time occupied number 1 and number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list. It started with a dream, followed with a resource. We realized how we could pull it off, and then took one action, stand in a line, and take the chance of pitching her in 10 seconds.
So what a perfect story for this episode. How did that feel when you and your partner had that realization and made the decision to stand in line?
Well, we were excited.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think we really thought of her saying no. We had imagined her saying yes. When she said yes, you know, the search for resources got much more vigorous.
Right.
Because we realized we had to figure out how are we going to go pitch this and then create it in such a way that it stood up to the standard of Omni Magazine, which at the time was award-winning for the quality of their production.
Well, this is such a great story. So just in the last moment here of our talk today, give us the steps that were involved in achieving this miraculous outcome.
First thing we did was, who do we know who might know somebody, right? Not who do we know who could do this, but who do we know who might know somebody who could help us pull this off? And so a lot of times it isn't, you know, who do I know? It's who do I know who might know someone?
Yeah, so you called on a resource.
We called on a resource to say, who's a sound designer that you might know who has this kind of ability? Found this incredible award-winning, you know, sound designer that helped us, you know, start into this whole process. One small action, and then realizing the resource might not be within my immediate sphere.
Reaching farther
and finding out who could help me kind of leapfrog into another realm of resources.
Well, let's leave our listeners with that thought today and invite them to do exactly what you did, which is reach beyond the immediate range to discover resources that could help each of them with whatever they're creating.
That sounds great. Well, and we'd love to hear your stories. So you can write to us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Thank you for joining in the conversation today. We'll talk to you again next week.